And on behalf of the Department of Global Governance at the Institute for the Foundations of Law at the University of Graz, it's my pleasure to wish you a very warm welcome to our lecture series, Peace Through Dialogue. So far, we've learned about the theory and practice of interactive conflict resolution, and in particular of problem solving and its application in conflicts such as Israel-Palestine, Sri Lanka, the Alps-Adriatic region, Cyprus, and others. Today, we will have a closer look at the theoretical framework which is necessary to conduct interactive conflict resolution, and we will explore reconciliation's identity paradoxes. So today we will have a lecture given by Tamra Pearson. Tamra is Professor of Conflict Resolution in the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the renowned University of Denver. She holds a PhD in social psychology from Harvard University, and she coordinates the University of Denver's Conflict Engagement and Resolution Initiative. Her research interests include identity and interaction dimensions of intergroup conflicts, reconciliation, peace building, track 2 diplomacy, and processes for intergroup conflict resolution, particularly in the Middle East, in Anatolia, or the Caucasus, where she has also engaged in conflict resolution practice. Her current peace-building research explores, among many other things, the benefits and pitfalls of environmental peace building, and she's the mastermind behind the book on which the lecture series is built upon, Shifting Protracted Conflict Systems Through Local Interactions, Extending Kelman's Legacy, which was published by Routledge. Our discussant for today will be Lusine Kharatyan. Lusine is a researcher at the Department of Cultural Anthropology of the National Academy of Sciences in Armenia, and she's the director of the Center for Continuing Education at Yerevan State University. From 2012 until 2018, she was responsible for the implementation of several multi-phase and multi-component Armenia-Turkey reconciliation projects involving also oral history research and adult education. Her research, publication, and practical works range from memory politics, education policy, reconciliation and conflict resolution to the issues related to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. And Lusine is also a member of the Council of Europe's expert committee responsible to evaluate the implementation of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. So let me particularly extend my welcome to the US and Armenia. And Tamra, I would like you to start your lecture.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Jürgen, and welcome. I look forward to engaging with you more in the discussion afterwards, as with everyone online. And again, welcome to all of you. So I'm going to be talking today about one of the chapters in our book, and in this case, it's one of the ones that I wrote and it focuses in particular on reconciliation. I am not going to review everything that's in the chapter. I'm hoping that perhaps people have had a chance to take a look at it. And if there are sections that I don't go over today that you would like me to talk a little bit about in more detail today, you can feel free to bring that up during the questions and answers and the discussion, okay? So let me just begin by saying that many of the tools for managing international conflicts, such as diplomacy and international negotiations, were developed for an interstate context. These tools fell short when contexts were interstate, which is usually between identity groups vying for control, and/or they involved groups that were not recognized as legitimate actors by one or more of the other actors. For example, a rebel movement or an identity group seeking autonomy. These diplomacy tools also did not allow for deeper conversations about conflict drivers and unmet basic human needs. You all have been hearing about interactive problem solving over the course of several weeks. Interactive problem solving initially developed to address these gaps, to allow face-to-face, unofficial, off-the-record engagement so that parties could learn about underlying conflict drivers and the concerns and constraints that were both political and psychological. Interactive problem solving could provide a forum for mutual learning and going underneath the rhetoric about intra-party differences, about relative priorities, about communication and narrative concerns, and about strategic and constructive framing. The human dimension of such interactions also began to soften the oversimplified view of the other, their motivations, and their options. A working trust could be cultivated, that when you network that across a number of influential participants, that can begin to move the relationship toward constructive, official negotiations. However, a negotiated settlement is a far cry from the establishment of a positive peace. Do we have students here in the audience? I'm guessing that some of you may have your cameras off, but let me put a question to some of the students here. Have you heard of the notion of positive peace that I just mentioned? Is that a new concept, or have you heard of that before? Okay, somebody's heard of it before. Great, Katarina, thank you for acknowledging. Do you have a sense of what the difference is between positive peace and negative peace? Want to take a guess?
I would take a guess, or I've heard about it before. Negative peace is the absence of violence, and positive peace is a lot more than that.
Good, good, absolutely. You got it. So positive peace is addressing some of the structural conditions that lead to continuing conflict, right? So we have negative peace may stop the fighting, but positive peace are the kinds of additional changes to the relationship, to the structures that are needed to actually deal with the underlying drivers and prevent negative and violent conflict from persisting, right? And we get those concepts from Johan Galtung. Thank you, Katarina. So again, to move towards structural change, that incorporates procedurally just governance practices, requires more than just settlement. Relationships need to be rewoven. So the political scientists Long and Breck, who have studied reconciliation, would suggest that intrastate conflicts go beyond interstate conflicts and add the additional challenge of restoring social order. The psychologist Nadler suggests that years of hostility and violence create enduring psychological barriers such as distrust, a sense of victimhood, and desires for revenge. And the well-known sociologist and peace scholar Lederach, who some of you may have also read, points out that in intra-group conflicts, parties have spent generations as neighbors, but have also experienced violence and trauma at each other's hands, resulting in deep-rooted animosity, fear, and severe stereotyping. Your Graz Professor Pirker points out how neglect of minority rights and needs is baked into the system in most states and is neglected by most peace processes. So though people have long recognized the need for reconciliation to restore wholeness in conflict contexts, many, including the UN under at least Boutros-Ghali, considered it a task for the post-conflict phase, something to promote integration and stabilization. However, more now see the need to undertake reconciliation alongside conflict resolution as another aspect of the system shifts that we've considered in this course. So how is reconciliation done? How are these relationships rewoven? So I'm going to talk about three things today. The first, what reconciliation is and how it is similar and different from conflict resolution. The second being what the tasks of reconciliation are. And finally, how interactive problem solving and related forms that we've discussed in this course, like interactive conflict transformation, can help with reconciliation, and in turn, how these processes might themselves need to change to help build toward reconciliation. So let's start first with what is reconciliation and how is it related to conflict resolution? There have been many attempts to describe the nature and essence of reconciliation, and you can read more about these in my chapter. But there's a few things that stand out. First and foremost, in all its uses, Reconciliation is about relationships. It's about bringing things together again, restoring, repairing. It's sometimes framed in terms of undoing prior events with an eye to future relationships, addressing backward to go forward. Others might cast this as redressing the past to go forward. In some ways, that brings us to the second commonality in a lot of the conceptualizations of reconciliation, which is that the nature of reconciliation is this mix of opposites. It's paradoxical. Again, another question for the students. What do we mean by something being paradoxical? What is a paradox? You want to give that one a try? I don't see any faces, so. It was in the title of my talk today. Katerina, you want to give it a shot?
I don't really have a definition for it, but I would say something that means different things at the same time.
Right, yeah, different things or things that seem like they shouldn't be able to coexist, being in the same space, right? Being, in a sense, in tension with each other. We might talk about it as meaning that we need to hold two contradictory notions at once. It also often means that it is not something that can be explained rationally or through a rational actor's lens, right? This somehow doesn't compute when you take a rational tack on something and then you have some alternative that doesn't fit a rational actor lens, but yet it's happening, right? So how is that paradox possible? How is it that we wrestle conceptually and probably practically and pragmatically with the fact that opposite notions oftentimes have to coexist, right? So thank you, Katerina. So several authors that try to capture this paradoxical nature of reconciliation include people like, again, Lederach, who considers reconciliation to be a space where interdependent parties wrestle with the paradoxes of truth, mercy, justice, and peace. So all of those notions, in a sense, interaction and intention with each other. Kreisberg also adds to truth and justice the requirements of respect and security. And finally, another example, Hamber and Kelly describe reconciliation as a braid with 5 interwoven strands, such as seeking justice and building relationships that may be in tension with each other, but all must be addressed holistically. Third, reconciliation is not a simple kind of change, but involves change of different forms at different levels of the relationship. Nadler, who I mentioned already, has what I think is a helpful pyramid for outlining. I didn't make any PowerPoints because last time that I did this, we had trouble with PowerPoints and the AV. So I'm just going to do a visual of a pyramid, right? Nadler uses a pyramid for outlining these different forms and levels. And at the base are social structural changes that are needed for reconciliation, which seek to address the asymmetries of power, access, and advantage. So activities that might work to transform these power relations might be things like new constitutional or legal arrangements. Ruhana is one of the scholar practitioners that takes this perspective. Then at that middle level of the pyramid are relational changes needed for reconciliation. These would be changing destructive relationship dynamics toward ones that are trustworthy, amicable, and supportive. Activities in the tradition of what we know as contact theory, using interdependent work on common goals, would fit in this category. as would the interactive problem-solving workshops that we've been talking about in this course that were developed by Kelman, Mitchell, Burton, and others, and used by many of the scholar practitioners who have contributed to this course, including myself and our host, Professor Pirker. Then at the top of Nadler's pyramid is identity-related changes that are needed for reconciliation. Now, this perspective or level emphasizes identity threats arising from perception of oneself negatively as either a victim or a perpetrator of conflict-related harm. Activities addressing this top level would be directed at rehabilitating parties' sense of a worthy identity and may include public apologies and truth and reconciliation commissions. We're going to return back to this level in a few minutes. So we've got a pyramid that tells us that there might be different levels and different forms of reconciliation that are needed. So how is reconciliation different from conflict resolution? That's a fair question, and it's one that Professor Kelman, who this course and this volume, in a sense, was developed to celebrate and raise up, he also wrestled with this question in the last phase of his life. Much of his work had focused on how to move parties toward the negotiation table so that they might develop a mutually satisfactory and hence durable peace agreement. He considered that reconciliation would follow upon the successful settlement of interests through conflict settlement processes like negotiation and the development of a better relationship via conflict resolution processes like interactive problem solving. However, after the failure of the Oslo Accords, which had developed out of the efforts of Kelman and others to create supportive channels and prepare cadres to engage across conflict lines, Kelman began to reconsider the sequencing. He came to view that because one of the chief aspects of reconciliation involved these identity-related changes, that this might actually need to happen in parallel with addressing interests and building relationships. So processes of conflict resolution and of reconciliation both need to happen. So we'll turn now to understanding more about what represents the unique tasks for reconciliation, in a sense, in addition to those that might be shared with conflict resolution, and how that separates it from conflict resolution, but also makes it necessary. So we're heading into the second section. What are the tasks of reconciliation, right? So our discussions so far have talked about the nature of what it is, but have only really nodded toward what needs to happen. We've highlighted that there are identity dimensions that seem to be uniquely important to engage with in reconciliation, and that there are tensions and paradoxes in doing so. Nadler, Kelman, and many others have focused on identity dimensions of protracted conflict and how moving toward reconciliation requires addressing these identity aspects, shifting these identity dynamics. A couple of ways of framing these identity dynamics are worth highlighting, I think. The first, a difficult dynamic of protracted conflict that Professor Kelman stressed was that in addition to many of the parties' interests being seen as zero sum, so that's, you know, what are the concerns and the aspects that need to be met in order to go forward with some sort of a negotiated solution. Many of these are seen as zero sum in protracted conflicts, but one of the things that Professor Kelman observed is that oftentimes in these conflicts, identities are seen as zero sum as well. So do any of you, so again, this is a student question, do any of you, have you heard of the term zero sum? Now this time I'm not going to make you answer it, but just tell me if you've heard of this term before. Give me a wave, give me a little emoji. There we go. Okay, so you've heard of this term of zero sum. Good. I suppose it's a little hard to say if you haven't, but we could go into more detail on this notion. Okay, Sarah, thank you too. We can go into more detail if people haven't heard of it, but basically this notion of, some people talk about it in terms of negative interdependence. It says that if I am to gain more, it has to be at your expense, in a sense. It takes away from you. And if you gain something, that somehow takes away from me. It's like having a fixed pie, right? And we have this zero-sum notion applied a lot of times when we study interest in looking at negotiations. There are certain kinds of negotiations that are actually developed to deal with issues that are zero-sum, where taking away from, or in a sense, you have to divide a fixed pie. And if one party gets more, it's at the expense of another party, right? So there's a certain kind of competitiveness that breeds into the dynamic in the way that people operate. But what Professor Kelman was highlighting, and he wasn't the only one that noticed this, but he very much thought that this was central to protracted conflicts, was this sense that not only are interests zero-sum, but that my identity, or that identities are zero-sum as well. So to accept the validity of the other party's identity seems to imply negating one's own identity. And the flip side, pressing for the acceptance and viability of one's own identity may undercut the other's same quest. So again, one key aspect of these identity dynamics that we need to think about in the process of reconciliation. Another difficult identity dynamic that Nadler and his colleagues identified was related to the role of being a victim or a perpetrator. So after the tremendous suffering in protracted conflicts, one can be at least counseled by the fact that one is innocent of wrong because of one's victim status. However, a victim status is also one that removes agency and a sense of control. On the flip side, the role of the perpetrator of violence brings moral injury, a reduced sense of belonging to a moral group, and fear of exclusion. To admit and accept that role is to risk exclusion from a larger community, and in a sense, a devaluing of part of one's identity, right? So from psychology, we know that it's very important for identity coherence to see oneself as having both agency and morality or coherence. So both the victim and the perpetrator identities are problematic. We're going to come back to that intersection in a few minutes. So an awareness of these identity dynamics points us toward what needs to happen in reconciliation. So one thing that needs to be removed is this negation of the other as a component of one's identity. So Kelman realized that this mutual identity denial was at the core of preventing protracted conflict resolutions, conflict relationships from going forward. He asserted that parties would need to reconceive of their own identities in ways that allowed for the existence of the other party's identities and narratives, even if not agreeing to it. He felt that as parties overcame the dynamic of perceived negative interdependence of their identities, this zero-sum dynamic, they could build on the positive interdependence of their identities. And we can unpack what that might mean a bit more in the discussion. He felt that if parties could have opportunities to engage in intentional, constructive interaction, again, interaction is a key here that we've been talking about throughout the course, then certain conditions for reconciliation could eventually emerge. And these are some of the conditions that he thought would be critical in order to counter this zero-sum dynamic. That through this interaction, you could have conditions like acknowledging each other's nationhood and community, developing a common moral basis for peace, confronting history. This was a new one for Professor Kelman. Acknowledging responsibility, and establishing patterns and mechanisms of cooperation. So moving to one of these other identity dynamics, we heard about identity needs and the threats to identity that come from being either in the role of victim or a perpetrator. And the way that this line of thinking conceives this, victims need to gain or regain a sense of power and control. So that's their basic need, in addition to other global basic human needs in conflict, that victims have this particular need as well. And perpetrators have this particular need, which is to preserve or regain a sense of moral validity, belonging, and acceptance. Unfortunately, the way people tend to address these identity needs often further contributes to a negative conflict cycle. Victims, in their need to gain a sense of control and self-esteem, will engage in vengeance. What some may consider justified vengeance, others will see as aggression, justifying or even requiring a response. So you have this cycle, right? Perpetrators, in their need to maintain a moral identity, may distance themselves from their acts, from the victim, or both. They disengage from their acts and from the other to preserve their self-image. We then see this well-known psychological dynamic of war making, where the other may be dehumanized or delegitimized as a fellow being or group worthy of existence, thus justifying violence. So in each case, the compensation and the attempt to meet that basic need in turn creates a dynamic that further justifies violence on both sides. So alternatively, the needs of both victims and perpetrators could be met, and this is where Nadler and his colleagues have done a lot of research, through a more virtuous cycle that is initiated by interaction, again, around apology and forgiveness. When perpetrators apologize and seek forgiveness, this puts the victim in a position of power and equality, being able to grant or withhold that forgiveness. In turn, the forgiveness given by the victim clears the moral debt, resulting in the ability for the perpetrator to reintegrate into the desired community. The challenge for this, and again, there's been lots of research that's looked at this in various contexts and how this can be initiated. But the challenge is that in many conflict contexts, these roles are not clear, the role of victim and perpetrator. Each side perceives itself to be a victim and avoids considering how it may have caused harm. One solution to this has been the approach of some Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where both parties reciprocate admissions of guilt or acknowledgement of harm and forgiveness, such as in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Another approach is to call attention to how parties have suffered in similar ways, creating an inclusive victim consciousness. And this has been shown to work, in some contexts. This is, results in more favorable attitudes towards the other, as well as an increased willingness to forgive, an increased willingness to reconcile, at least when it's focused on talking about suffering more broadly, rather than specific examples of suffering. So then finally, going back to this one other piece of identity dynamics that seems to be a core part of protracted conflicts, and that is recognizing the centrality of moral identity. This may be one of the keys to unlocking the ability for identities to shift. And I think you'll see that there's more and more attention being paid to this aspect of conflicts. And I know that your speaker next week, Jeff Sewell, will be picking up a bit on this as well. We know that meaning and morality are central aspects of identity. So creating the possibility that group members can acknowledge harms their group has done in a way that reinforces their values and their moral identity, rather than, in a sense, undercuts it, right? Reinforces their moral identity and their values, could be central. In the chapter, I bring in the work of Ria Shibata on narratives and the perceived sense of inherited responsibility in Japanese-Korean relations that she has studied. She found that the value of taking responsibility for past harms could be reinforced, confirming rather than threatening moral identity. In her study of Japanese youth, she found that those most willing to accept responsibility for Japanese wartime harms were those who saw this value of taking responsibility as a positive value and as a positive aspect of their Japanese identity. They were also more likely, the folks that were, in a sense, leaning in this direction, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum, they were also more likely to have had contact with the other side and more likely to know about even their own history and the other's history. And so again, this is a pattern that we'll see in some of the other results, and Lusine, I'm looking forward to hearing about your insights into that dimension of this as well. So what this suggests is that creating engagement conditions between adversaries where, on the one hand, self-esteem and moral aspects of identities can be reinforced is going to be important, and where both narratives and histories can be told and learned. So we have looked at what reconciliation is. We've talked a bit about some of the core challenges and paradoxes within reconciliation. And again, in this talk, particularly focusing on the identity challenges, given that in many of the other conversations, both in this course and in this literature, the focus tend to be more on the relational and the structural, especially the relational, but also the structural. So we've taken much more of a focus today on the identity dimension. So if we are going to continue to look at interactive problem solving and its related processes, are there things that these processes can actually contribute to reconciliation? And in turn, we can ask, are there things that these processes should be doing more of in order to address some of these dynamics that we've been talking about that reconciliation seems to demand attention to? So the first part, in a sense, how can interactive problem solving potentially be part of contributing to reconciliation? We know that most intergroup reconciliation processes primarily focus on action or events that might address the unaddressed sense of harm, humiliation, and grievance. Things like public apologies and other symbolic gestures can address the need for acknowledgement. There are other public activities like reparations that convey not only a recognition of a wrong committed in the past, but a commitment to right the wrong going forward. All of these tend to be public. So we might want to ask, are there also contributions from the domain of interactive problem solving and interactive conflict transformation that can complement these public steps and possibly also contribute to the tasks that we have talked about already, such as removing the negation of the other as a component of one's identity, removing identity threats, and reframing the sources of moral identity. So again, we do know that interactive problem solving and related processes have been shown to contribute to the other parts of the pyramid, the structural conditions for reconciliation and the relational dimensions of reconciliation. And you can read a bit more about that in my chapter if you like. And there's a lot more literature on that. So focusing in on that top part of the pyramid, the identity dimension of reconciliation, we do know that research on identities have shown that they are changeable and sensitive to context. And I talk a little bit about the psychology behind that in the chapter. Different identities are evoked by different contexts and different framing. Therefore, we know that as central as identities are for framing and giving meaning to the world, we can shape the way people experience and express their identities by shaping the context and shaping the interaction. So let that sink in a little bit. That's how we're going to be thinking about how interactive conflict transformation, interactive problem solving, these interactive processes that are private rather than public might be able to reshape how identities emerge and then are seen as ways then to shape the world and frame the world going forward. So the last part of my chapter does a bit of a deep dive into ways that identity conceptions can be shifted using these interactive processes. It also considers the emotional mechanisms by which shifts might happen, particularly in the way that interactions and framing can impact the experience of conflict-related emotions like hatred, anger, guilt, hope, empathy. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now here, but we can unpack that a bit more if you like in the discussion. Needless to say, suffice it to say, there are varying ways that we can look at how emotions and framing and the things that are done in these interactive conflict transformation processes allow for shifts to take place. And those shifts oftentimes are linked to shifts in emotion. We know from psychology that emotions direct things and compel our motive. They're a source of both attention and motivation. And so as emotions shift, the way that you frame and understand both what is important to think about and how to go forward, what actions to take, can shift. Now that doesn't mean that you necessarily focus in an unrealistic and kind of artificial way on shifting an emotion. I'm not arguing for that. But what I'm suggesting is that as we look at some of the conditions that are already present in interactive processes, we see how they are meeting the conditions for allowing emotions to shift. And also then by doing that, we can understand then why we do see the kinds of shifts that we do see in interactive conflict transformation and interactive problem solving. And we already have a question. That's good. We'll get to you soon, Sarah. So just to wrap up, I am going to just consider a few ways that interactive conflict transformation could contribute to the tasks of reconciliation. And so just to summarize a few of those. And again, you can look at these in more detail in the chapter. But first, one way is that it creates a safe, private space for change in the way that public spaces don't allow for, right? We already know the dynamics of a public space. It's kind of the antithesis of creating a context for change, right? So change is going to happen typically more in private spaces. And so we haven't gone into a lot of detail today on the way interactive problem solving workshops are set up or run, but I know we've talked about it in past weeks, and we can talk about it more if you like. But in creating those safe private spaces, what is it that from today we want to emphasize that does? Well, one is that it creates a space for seeing the other differently and seeing the self differently, right? That's been a real theme today. It allows for the possibility of self-examination to potentially consider how to acknowledge past harms that one's group may have inflicted, or how to experience guilt safely. Guilt is not an emotion we like to experience, but it's going to need to be, if it's going to happen, it needs to happen in a safe kind of space, right? And that, all that self-exploration can be coupled with self-affirmation, which a lot of this research suggests is a real key to the difference between how you take and incorporate these changes, right? All of these kinds of changes are linked, we didn't talk about this already, but linked at some level to self-esteem. And so making sure that there is a self-affirming aspect of the interaction is going to be key. So, and again, this is a kind of context, it's kind of a process that can allow that to take place. Another piece that interactive problem solving and related processes can do is it includes this really central aspect of change requiring interaction with the other. There's lots of different ways you can find out about the other, but if you are in interaction, that is a fundamentally different way of you then thinking about the other. And again, emotions is probably a part of that. It so allows you to have this different sense of the other. You know, you're going to gain new information about the other, and you're going to get new perspectives, and you're going to be put in the context of interaction where, as you gain information and new perspectives on the other, it's going to, at some level, force you to think about yourself differently, right? Because you think about yourself in interaction with others. That's just how we create the sense of self, both individual self and group identity. It also allows for parties to see that engagement with the other can express one of their own values. This is, and again, another thing that Professor Kelman emphasized, that the fact that you're willing to come together and engage with the other can be seen as a positive value. They also allow for parties to see acknowledgement and taking responsibility for harm as a source of pride and moral identity. At least it can be shaped that way, right? So, and then let's just finalize this by summarizing some of the ways that we could do ICT better by including some other things that then would connect to the reconciliation tasks. And so some of the things that we could add and do better with ICT is including a focus on the past as well as the future. There are absolutely variations of interactive conflict transformation that include a focus on the past, even though a lot of the earlier framings of this work did not. And in fact, I think when Wilfried Graf and Gudrun Kramer were speaking, and Oliver Fink, that was included in their description of their version of the process, right? Another thing that's important for us to continue to think about adding is placing a value on accepting responsibility and reinforcing this as a positive identity aspect. We could also further consciously create experiences in the interaction that shift emotions, that support these shifts in emotions that are linked to things like readiness to reconcile. And those would be, again, these dynamics that we have seen can support shifts in anger, hatred, guilt, hope, empathy. And then finally, we already do this, but creating more space for cross-cutting identities and identity realignment, recognizing that the interactive problem-solving space or interactive conflict transformation space is a crucible if you will, or you can use another metaphor, is a canvas, right? Where things can be redefined and negotiated and re-expressed in different ways. And that's the beauty of interaction and interactive context. And so if you're creating this crucible that you can allow for identity realignments and also identity reflection within groups, which many writers now also stress as a key aspect of moving stuck conflicts away from being stuck. It's looking at internal, intra-group identity conversations. And we're going to hear more in 2 weeks from Maya Kahanoff, who looks at that in her work. So I'll close there and look forward to hearing from Lusine and all of you.
Thank you very much, Tamra. And Sarah, I promise we come to your questions soon. I would just love to bring in our discussant first. And Lusine, please evaluate this thrilling and thought-provoking talk from your perspective. And please feel free to bring in your perspective, your experience, or even examples from Armenia, Turkey, and probably also Armenia, Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much, Tamra, for a very good presentation. Of course, I have read the chapter because I was preparing for this discussion. And also thank you, Jürgen, for the opportunity. So I think today I would kind of link to whatever you have told in theory to the practice we had in this Armenia-Turkey reconciliation project. I will not, I mean, while I have been also involved in Armenia-Azerbaijan projects, I will not bring it in because it's a very different story in a way. And I think given the current developments around the conflict, there isn't much to discuss, particularly in terms of identity shift or change or reconciliation with that respect. So maybe in the future there will be more examples, but it's at the moment it's more like creating more and more narratives with I would say also chosen trauma narratives that come into this conflict also from the previous unresolved Armenia-Turkey conflict in a way. But I will not touch upon that, and I'll just bring some examples on what Tamra has been speaking about. So the project, just to provide you a context, I have been really involved in for several years, from 2009 up until 2015. It was an intervention designed to encourage reconciliation process between Armenia and Turkey. And the way the project was designed was, of course, interactive workshops, but plus, because of the specific of the conflict and because of the historical nature of it, and because of the fact that the actual genocide, which is the root of it, happened 100 years ago, and there are no people who were directly affected by it, but it's until now, it's one of the cornerstones of the Armenian identity, and it's the master narrative wherever you go in Armenia or in diaspora in most cases. So it is the entire, in many cases, the identity is constructed around that issue. And of course, in that construction of the current Armenian identity, there is certain portrayal of the Turkish side or group Turkish identity. So just for students, I don't know how much aware you are of historical circumstances. I will not go into historical details, but for the purposes of this particular thing to provide some insights from our practice, I just would like to pay attention to the fact that Armenians living in Armenia did not have any interaction with the Turkish side for the almost entire duration of the Soviet Union, because there was this Iron Curtain and there was no, even though like from Yerevan to the Turkish border, it's 40 kilometers only. Of course, we couldn't drive to Turkey and we cannot do it until now, but it's a different story. Just the meaning of it is that there were no direct interactions between people. So whatever knowledge, whatever stereotypes, whatever perception of Turks they had was mostly coming from history, textbooks, memory, collective memory, and narratives that were constructed both at public level, at state level, but also from the families that survived genocide, and then these stories would go from one generation to another. And just one more insight, because this is important for me to then speak about the reconciliation workshops we had, is that in fact, up until 1960s, genocide was a forbidden topic in the public space also in Armenia, not in diaspora, because the Soviet Union had an agreement with Turkey that wouldn't allow saying anything bad towards Turks and so on. So there wasn't a collective memory of genocide mostly in the public space. It remained mostly as part of family narratives or family stories. So you wouldn't see much about genocide, neither in literature nor in textbooks and so on. It was only at the end of the 60s when this changed and when Genocide Memorial was built. So this is just background about the issue we are dealing with. In 2009, maybe you know, there was this football diplomacy that was mostly in track 1, because it was like state contacts and so on. And within this, after this was somehow opened, several also many second track initiatives bloomed in Armenia and in Turkey, which would have different approaches to supporting this reconciliation process, because already at the official level, there were some steps kind of showing that this conversation could go further and something could be solved. So our initiative was one of these many, but it was a very interesting and specific one, and also one of the probably most known in a way. The intervention itself was designed so that students from Turkey and Armenia, young people, could get engaged in workshops, and through the process of learning about sensitive history, discuss the historical matters, and then come to reconciliation in their private space. By private space, I mean the workshops we had organized under the project, but also there were some opportunities for making whatever has been done, created under the project, public, and thus engaging more people into this process. So the core group we are speaking about, the core group of people who were directly involved, were 10 students from Armenia and 10 students from Turkey, and of course organizers and experts that were also involved in the project. As the project had several phases, I will not tell about all of them, but I will just, based on the examples that Tamra has already brought in this lecture before and in her chapter, I will bring examples from the practice, how that worked in practice. So one of the first things you have about reconciliation tasks is sensitive inclusion of the past. And as many of you know, of course, if we deal with the situation related to genocide and it's a past thing, we need to sensitively include past into the process. Otherwise, we couldn't just keep speaking about the future without really dealing with the core issue. So what we did, the intervention was designed in the way that the students will be first trained in oral history interview, and then they would go in one of the phases, for example, in different project phases, this would be done differently. But in one of the phases, the group together, Armenian and Turkish participants, would go to a settlement that was previously populated mostly by Armenians, which was Mush, currently it's Turkey. And we would stay together with them 2 weeks in this area. And they would together in couple, because Armenians would not speak Turkish or Kurdish, and their Turkish and Kurdish colleagues would help with translation, would go and interview people about the history of the place and their families in the place, which of course would include this sensitive kind of understanding the sensitivities involved in the history of the space itself. And then next year, or not next year, several months later, the same group would come to Armenia and would go to the settlements of genocide survivors the current generations of genocide survivors who were originally from this same place, and would do similar interviews with these people. This would allow to bring into the workshop not only personal histories of people involved, which was part, of course, of the workshop, but also the history of the place or space as perceived by the people who are currently living there and whose ancestors were living there years ago. So this was how the past was somehow included in the project. And of course, every day after they would come back from the field, we would have really long reflection sessions, which would reflect not only on what they have seen in the field, but also their emotions and whatever feelings they had after listening to people's stories and encountering these narratives in the field. So this is how this sensitive past was incorporated into the project. And it was a really very interesting experience because people got very emotional. They were not expecting to learn, to hear the stories that they heard sometimes. And these stories also created new conversations within themselves, because that's another thing, I will reflect on that later. But this is about this first task of involving sensitive inclusion of the past into the workshop itself. And at the end, by the way, students themselves wrote essays based on the fieldwork they have done. And the thing was, we did not, most of the essays are authored by an Armenian and Turkish students. So they worked in couples, which meant that they negotiated further the text and the experiences and also the past they have learned about. The other task, I mean, I'm going back to the chapter. It's it's like how you accept responsibility during this process. And of course, in the Armenian master narrative, it's Armenians are victims and Turks are perpetrators. And it's not just the Armenian master narrative because, well, it is a genocide. It's like this relationship, perpetrator and victim. But recognizing guilt and then apologizing for that is a very problematic and sensitive thing itself, and how you construct this workshop that this becomes possible. And not also putting this burden into the young people that are part of the emotional burden of the currently being there as a representative of a perpetrator group or a representative of a victim group. And here what is interesting, and of course this is recognition, and I think Tamra has mentioned about that, and it's also a very interesting discussion in the chapter itself. It's recognizing that the group you speak to is not a monolithic group. It consists of different people with different identities and different narratives. And this was a very interesting asymmetric situation in our project, and I think in most Armenia-Turkish reconciliation projects, because among particularly youth in Armenia, the identity is perceived as very essential, in very essentialistic sense. Like they do not, that there isn't this perception of constructed identity and the fact that it's fluid, that it changes, that it's not one thing, every person has multiple identities and so on. Most of the young people in Armenia do not have this perception. And this comes also from the fact that we have been very monoethnic country, and because of the persistent traumatic identity, it's a country and it's like they want to stick with whatever they have, and also Soviet policies were supporting this essentialistic view of identity, but it's a different conversation. I'm not going into that. And in contrast to the Armenian student group, Turkish student group included people with really different identities, not only in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, in terms of background, but also this clear perception of that identity is not something essential. So both in terms of really the group being consisting of different people with different identities changed this dynamic within the group, because Armenians who came to the project, well, they came, well, we should first realize that people who come to such project, it means they already want to learn something. They want to get engaged in the process, because what we do an open call, and then usually these are people who are already ready to get engaged for different reasons, but they are. However, from the Armenian side, this dynamic was mostly that they came to know who this perpetrator is and to get at the end the result of recognizing genocide, at least among the participants, if not the state. I mean, this maximalistic view that they came in was mostly about that. And from Turkish side, these were people who were already involved in different complex activism and projects, because mostly they were victims of their own state. They had structural problems with the Turkish state being violent, with the structural violence of Turkish state towards different minorities or people with different views. So this would be either people of Kurdish origin or other minority origin or different political views, leftists, LGBT community. So people who were vulnerable within their own society, but who, because of their vulnerability and because of their struggle with their own state, they considered Armenian genocide as part of one of the things they were doing, as something that needed attention because of their identity also. So that's a very different group. And I think in the dynamics here is when the recognition among Armenian participants came that, you see, these Turks, or whatever as they were framed, are not this monolithic perpetrator who kind of systematically killed the Armenians, but these young people are facing very complicated problems at the moment. And they started understanding Turkish society better, and also understanding that it's not just clear-cut, I don't know, whatever identities there, but that it consists of very different people and different identities. And here, when it came the issue of negotiating this apology and also forgiveness, which is a central theme in case of the Armenian genocide. And I would bring an example from the field visit we had in Armenia when the group went to interview some Armenians in a village. And the woman whom they went to interview, she opened the door and she said that she will not allow any Turkish person to enter her house until this person says that he accepts the Armenian genocide. So she radically put this acceptance thing in front of everybody, while before that it was not, I mean, it has been negotiated in private conversations, discussed. What about state recognizing it? What about, okay, I personally recognize that genocide happened, but it's a different story. I'm struggling against my state. I'm involved in all these struggles in many different ways. But here you are in a field and the woman says, I'm not allowing you to enter my house until you say that you recognize the Armenian genocide. And this is where it became really interesting, because there were 3 people going to this house, and one of them said, okay, I recognize the Armenian genocide, and entered. And then there was this girl who really initiated a very interesting conversation, because you said, you know, here I see a problem, because Turkish people close when you immediately say that you either recognize or not. Maybe if we start from a conversation and understanding each other better, we could move forward, and then the recognition could also come. I cannot say from the very beginning that I recognize until I'm involved in a conversation with you. So I am bringing this as an example how problematic this recognition and not recognition can be, and how like some people who were involved in the workshop and who would say in private space that they recognize genocide, they would not do the same in the public space, because it's one thing when you say to your friend that you recognize, and it's a different story when you say about it publicly in Turkey, for example. Even though the times we speak about, Turkey was comparatively open country, you could express some thoughts and so on. So, and here is when the other level of recognition and this perpetrator-victim conversation came in, when they had to negotiate their own texts. So in some texts, you see that they have negotiated to have the word G word, as they say, genocide word, as open in the text. And in some other texts, you see that they only quote the people they have interviewed using the word genocide, but they as authors do not use the word. So again, this recognition and then forgiveness or not forgiveness is part of different processes going on through these reconciliation workshops we had. But at the end, there was a symbolic moment of recognition, because when they were in Armenia, it was April 24, which is the Genocide Commemoration Day. And they, as a group, went to the Genocide Memorial, thus showing that they recognized that, as some framed it in the workshop, something happened, as the others said that genocide happened to Armenians. So just bringing you examples to show how the workshop dynamic can go on and how they negotiated their identities throughout this process in a way that Armenians started to understand that identity is not this essential thing that comes with you and goes forever. And also they started to recognize that this constructed other consists of many different people, and that it's not just like this perpetrator who organized the genocide and who continues to deny it, but also that there are people who struggle within their society for the recognition of the genocide. This is how this shifted, because the trust started coming out, at least in conversations. But in the next stage, and this is also discussed when you bring examples from other societies of similar situations, it's not only your own problem, but you bring examples from other situations. And one of the components of our intervention was a study visit to Germany to learn from the German experience of Holocaust and how the past has been processed in Germany. And this was one of the most traumatic experiences, particularly for Turkish participants, because all the meetings were designed in a way that they were feeling themselves like, even they were open complaints that, it's like they point out to us that we are perpetrators. Nobody was telling that, but the feeling of guilt and a feeling of being a perpetrator was there because of a study visit to another state, not because of Armenia. In Armenia, they did not have that same feelings, which was quite interesting. But because of the way this has been processed in Germany, and them kind of putting themselves in the role of Germans and then Armenians in the role of Jews because of the study visit in a way, they felt more guilty in Germany, and they physically felt very bad than they even felt when they were in Armenia. So this is how that also changed. And honestly, I have to mention that some Turkish participants dropped out at certain stages of the project, at different stages, because it was very hard for them to walk it till the end. However, there was a core group who walked till the end, and this was an identity transforming process, both for Armenians and for Turks, because Armenians also who participated in the process, they really stopped thinking that it's just demand recognition and so on, and all Turks are killers, because there is this stereotypical perception and such deeply rooted distrust and so on. So their perception of Turkish society has changed, and they started also somehow behaving as moderators between Turkish society and Armenia, like in many other public platforms, saying, it's not true, like whatever you are saying, it's not like all Turks are not killers with whatever, and also telling that people in Turkey are also currently having very big problems because of the state and so on. And then the next point, I don't know whether I'm touching upon all the points, maybe not, but just some examples to show how it worked, at least in our experience. Yeah, identity shift, whether it happened or not, it's hard to judge, but I can say that at least for Armenians, Armenian participants, they definitely have now, I mean, whoever has been part of our projects have a more fluid understanding of identity in a way that it can change. And if you change it, and that it's not like it comes from your birth and it stays with you till the end of your life, and that Armenian identity definitely involves hating the Turks. So these kind of narratives are gone, but also in terms of moral identity or in terms of values. They came to realize that there are people on the other side of the border that share the same values as they do, and that they have more similarities with these people than maybe in their own country with people who have different moral principles and different values. So in a way, this has changed because they now realize that similarities are also based on shared values. So if I have a friend in Turkey who shares my values, then we are more similar with him than with a mass murderer in Armenia. And that is a shift identity, that is an identity shift, and it's also a shift in perception of how they now want to deal with the issue of genocide, or at least with the issue how genocide is narrated in Armenia. So it also happened, but I wouldn't say that it happened to all the participants. It happened to some of them, and for some of them, this change didn't happen. As in many other workshops, it's not everybody who undergoes all the stages. Maybe these are most of the points I would like to reflect from the practice we had, but also just one more thing. Well, private space is vital, and it's very important that in this private space you share not only historical issues, but also your personal stories and who as a person you are. And this is how that interaction builds. However, we had, as I mentioned, also some public initiatives, and among those public initiatives was publication and dissemination of a book and a documentary film. Documentary film was about the workshop itself, and you see all these heated discussions and reflection sessions in the documentary. And we organized movie screenings, and also we disseminated the books, the book published, which were like jointly written articles in the book. And we had a traveling exhibition. In this way, we took the stories, oral histories we have recorded in the field to broader public, but we also included people, actual students who were involved in the workshop to show this process from oral history, from space, through these workshops to their personal experiences, emotions, and so on. I will stop now. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lusine, for all these fascinating insights to your work and for picking up so many points that Tamra addressed in her talk. And Tamra, will you respond directly?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much. It's so rich, and there's so many aspects of this that are complementary and really help to illustrate some of these more theoretical and conceptual points. So I so appreciated that. Maybe I'll just pick up on maybe 3 or 4 things that I would like to underline that I appreciated that you brought in. The first that you brought in very early, and also I talk about in my chapter as well, is the importance of sharing personal experiences, right? That in a sense, you could argue that that is the value of having more private spaces. In public spaces, people don't tend to share personal experiences. I mean, I suppose it's probably not completely impossible to somehow frame a public event where people shared their personal experiences. And I think that could be quite powerful for people. But it doesn't tend to happen in those spaces. And so, you know, when you can create spaces where personal experiences can be shared, that ends up being, and actually my colleague Eileen Babbitt and I did some research on this years ago to try to identify what was the difference between workshops, interactive problem solving workshops that tended to be seen more successfly and those that maybe weren't. And this was a piece of it. This was the key. It was that if what we trace it back to is that it allows people to go beyond the rhetoric and allows people to hear each other in a way that you can't hear it if it's framed in terms of a master narrative or in terms of rhetoric, right? You know, if people talk about that rhetoric or master narrative, that, you know, they push play and it comes out and the other side has probably already heard it before, right? So you're not necessarily getting any change. But when you hear someone talk about the personal experiences or their experience of their family, first of all, those are experiences that you can't like turn it off and deny it. It is somebody else's experience, right? And so you have to at least hear it as valid within that person's frame, within that person's life experience. That did happen. And so it requires you to at least listen to it in a way that you might not otherwise. And then going back to the emotion that we talked about earlier, if someone's sharing a heartfelt story, and again, this is where it needs to be in context so that this isn't done performatively, right? Because if it's a performance of a personal story, it has less impact. But if it feels genuine, then your emotions are going to be impacted. You're going to have empathy with the experiences, with the emotions that they're experiencing. And then what it also does, and this goes to one of the other points that you raised, it allows people to see the other as not all the same too, right? That was another key piece in the research that I review in the chapter about how a way to start to change the experience of anger is when you can see the other side as both variable. They're not everybody's the same. People have had different experiences and have different priorities and different, you know, stages of life. I mean, and you start to see things similar to you as well. And you start to see the other as malleable, as changeable.
And you see yourself also differently.
Yes, right.
That's like how it.
Right. You see yourself as you know that you have variability in your own group, but you start to see that you can change too, right? That change is a normal part of human experience. The other, another maybe third or fourth point, I don't know where we're at, where I'm at this point, that I thought was really helpful was this conversation is fascinating, where you could, you might not acknowledge the genocide, but you put in the essay that you heard the voice of someone else talking about it that way. And to even take the step of writing an essay where you're voicing someone else's perspective.
Is already.
I mean, that's huge, right? Oh. You know, you may not agree with it, but the very fact that you're voicing someone else's perspective means you're giving it enough validity as an alternative perspective to put it in there, right? And then another important point that I think you raised, that I'd like to ask you a little bit more about is the importance of the interaction itself. So presumably, I mean, it sounds like on the Armenian side, people had less contact with Turks before this. But on the Turkish side, people would have had some interaction with Armenians, but in this case, you know, they could have just learned this information from media. They could have just watched TikTok. I mean, they could have gotten information from museums or from books, but what was it that you felt that mattered about the interaction aspect itself, rather than just getting the information from movies or some other kind of source?
So the interaction aspect, basically, I mean, it helped to first see human being in the other, which was like whatever you learn about the society from internet or movies or reading and so on, you don't humanize it. You have this, well, from one side, you have this dehumanized perspective of the other side. And on the other side, you have these stories of Asala terrorist group who is terrorizing your government. You don't know for what reason usually. It's not like it's a very open conversation in both sides. So you don't kind of have touch of the person being human. On Turkish side, people from Istanbul, of course, they have seen Armenians, but it's not the case everywhere. And maybe they had more interaction with Turkish Armenians than Armenians with Turks, at least from these young people from Armenia. I'm not saying that all Armenians had never had interaction with Turks. I'm speaking about this particular group because it would be an overgeneralization. But then the interaction makes the other more human, and you start engaging in conversation with that other. And the conversation is not necessarily and not always about the past, because the oral history component already makes it clear that where you are in a project that you will listen to personal stories, family stories, and it is about past, but it would be more about present. Like they would know about each other, what kind of music you listen to, what are your interests, and so on. Particularly that they stayed in a region both in Turkey and Armenia, which was like more or less rural, and not many things were possible. So they had to know more and more each other, in addition to whatever project components were. So that interaction would be about personally knowing each other more and knowing personal stories as well, which added value to the entire, and it's not all and of course not all the interaction was designed and structured into the project. I mean, if I got your question right, I might have.
Yeah. You know, and then I don't know if I should hold up on this question or not, but one of the things that really stood out from what you said was that you said that there was a change in how the genocide was narrated. And so I'd be curious to know, you know, I didn't talk very much about that in my talk today. I mean, I talk a little bit about it in the chapter, right? That the importance of narratives, in a sense, as a way of kind of being public carriers for identities, and that these narratives, there's lots of interesting research out there on narratives and how they become justifications for certain kinds of actions and way of framing the other and all of that then drive the relationship, the conflict relationship. So to me, this sounds like this would be really huge, that if participants in your project started to narrate the genocide differently, how did that look?
I wouldn't, because, well, there were, at least in one of those the component I told about, by narrated differently, I meant that it would be more multi-perspective narration. It would be constructed from both sides, first of all. It wouldn't be this just like Armenian narration of genocide or Turkish narration of some events that happened, I don't know. But it would include multi-perspectivity in terms of sources, voices, and also the way you speak about that. And also it was not the only component, was not essays. We also had performance in the project, which allowed both more emotional involvement and also narrating the stories they have encountered as a performance on a stage. So they would bring a lot of not only just stories, human stories that they have heard, or memories, or I don't know, oral histories, but they would also perform it like as a dance, as music, as other things which wouldn't be usual ways that they were used to. Well, there are always some artistic ways of telling the story, but for them personally, this was quite new experience. So, but multi-perspectivity would be the main thing, and also acceptance that history is plural.
Ooh, cool.
So I'm bringing in these things that actually, and as I said, it wouldn't be obvious for all the participants, but it was one of the outcomes that they themselves have noted also at the end.
Yeah. Well, and you could say that if history is plural, then identities could be plural too.
Exactly.
So good. That's all I have, Jürgen. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this also very enriching discussion now. Thank you both so much. I think it's a wonderful sign that in our discussions, we are usually running out of time because everyone is so eager to discuss the talks. And of course, we can still do this next time as well. I would just like to hint at some final points. I will not ask some questions, but just try to pull some things together. I mean, we learned today from a theoretical and a practical perspective how to, as Kalman framed it, open one's own identity a little for the presence of the other as well. And Kalman in his work talked about the shifting the core or the periphery of identity. And he said that changing the periphery, so elements that are not as important as the core, might be much easier. And we should think about how to make things that are in the core part of the periphery and make them changeable. And we learned that it can be done by kind of changing, shaping the context, or using a different framing of identity as well. And in talks that we already heard before, we also learned how to change these core elements if they are non-negotiable, or at least appear to be non-negotiable. Within the projects that we did in the Alps-Adriatic region, one of the participants just recently published a book that he named Identity Without an Enemy Image. Because on the one hand, he acknowledges that identity usually needs some reference to the other, because I can't be myself without someone being the other, but this doesn't necessarily have to be framed in a negative way. And he tries to outline how to overcome by using processes or undergoing even and reflecting his experience in processes of interactive conflict resolution, how to overcome this notion of the identity with an enemy image. And what he also learned is that we could frame this tension between the victim and the perpetrator image of oneself and the other by using a kind of a picture of a shared history of violence, where we understand that under which circumstances who was a victim, and under which other circumstances probably who was a perpetrator as well. And this might be changing in conflicts at different stages, at different phases of the conflict. And it could be framed as a kind of a shared history of violence without, of course, relativizing the power asymmetry between groups that are usually involved in conflicts. So with these thoughts, I would like to hint to the next lecture that will be given by Jeff Sewell from Harvard. It will be in 1 week, and it will be about learning to accommodate others' worldviews. So thank you very much for attending this lecture. See you next time. Have a nice day, have a nice evening, have a good night. Thank you so much.